No, actually, I'm Lara Parker, and my duty is to talk to you about my books. For those of you who don't know very much about them, I've written 4, and they are a continuation of the Dark Shadow stories in my mind. I just decided that if the show went off the air, the show would still go on the page. So I had a wonderful time writing them. The first one actually is Descent, for those of you who don't know, was the story of my character's childhood in Martinique. And I got to tell the story of the great romance between Barnabas and Angelique, when he seduced her and they made love in the river and the gardens and everywhere. So I got to put that on the page. And then, of course, he rejected her for her much lovelier and much richer mistress. And you know the rest of that story. The second book, The Salem Branch, in my idea was that Angelique would have had a predecessor, an incarnation, an earlier incarnation. In 1694 in Salem, during the Salem witch trials. And I always thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to tell the story of a witch, someone who really was a witch. Because those poor ladies that were hung in Salem were not witches. But Miranda, who was Angelique's earlier incarnation, and I think a really wonderful character, she had powers, she could fly. So I had a wonderful time writing her story. The third book, Wolfman Rising, was a kind of blend of David grown up, now has a girlfriend, rides around on a snowmobile, and he and his little darling who lives next door go back in time to the 20s, searching for Quentin's portrait, which has been lost. And Quentin is freaked out because he knows he's going to turn into a werewolf. So, third book was probably the most complicated one, the most challenging. So when I got around, and of course I had to do a lot of research in the 20s, because they went back to the 20s after Prohibition, so that's kind of exciting. Then the fourth book will be out in November, and it is the story of Victoria. Who was she? And it's told in first person. So I'm going to read you a little piece of it, but you have to imagine that Alexandra Mulkey is standing up there, not Lara Parker. Are there any questions? Anyhow, this particular book, most of the research that I did was on the gypsies. Because as you all remember, there was a gypsy, and there were several other gypsy characters, and there were gypsies kind of hanging around Hollisport. So I thought it would be interesting to integrate them into the story and their kind of wild life that they live. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes. So what happens with Vicky is, I won't tell you how, but she comes back to the present. She has a job working in Bangalore on a television studio. Huh? Oh, are you? Oh, well, you and Vicky were there together. And she gets a letter from a lawyer saying that I need to talk to you. Can you come to Collinsport? And she goes back to her old house, where she hasn't been there in several years. It's been several years. To Collinwood. I hope you don't get bored. This is a novel, so novels are kind of long-winded. So I tried to cut it down to what I hoped would be interesting scenes to you, but because of the many layers in novels, some of it seems a little confusing. I don't mean to be apologizing, but If anyone wants to get up, then now's the time. Since you were expecting Dominic. So she comes back to Collinwood. Vicky, it's Vicky, right? Not this. My first impression of the grounds was that the lawns had been left unmowed for weeks. I was standing in a meadow of wildflowers and grasses gone to seed. Bees hummed about the nodding blossoms. A grasshopper leapt across my path, and the walk was obscured by overgrown weeds. I stopped and looked back towards the road. The wind had combed the grasses into a foamy sea, and there were ripples woven through the green, as though hikers had wandered through and left trails. I heard the ravens calling again, and squinting into the sun, I studied their flight as they glided in a widening gyre over the spires of the mansion. One swooped down, and I caught sight of his shadow against the slate roof. A stab of fear startled me, and holding my breath, I searched the ground for my own shadow, and I was relieved to see its dark shape on the pavement, stretching along the way from my feet. When I approached the house, I noticed a fine dust had been blown into the corners of the portico, and I wondered whether Willie Loomis was gone now, since he had always been such a conscientious caretaker. Pausing at the great oak door, I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated, and once again I felt a wave of shyness. What if I was no longer welcome in Collinwood, or in the few years I had been away? What if I had been forgotten? Perhaps I was overconfident, even arrogant, believing that I could return with surprise, believing that I would be received with surprise and a warm embrace, and that I would be given back my old room, when I actually had no reason to think that that would be so. I should have written Elizabeth first, but I left Bangor in such a hurry, and I remembered there had been a telephone at the Great House, but I hadn't taken time to look up the number. Shrugging off these worries as mere nervousness, I lifted the clapper and let it fall. As I waited for Mrs. Johnson, I felt my heart race with anticipation, and I realized I was excited by the prospect of seeing Roger and Carolyn again, and most of all, dear Elizabeth, who had always been so kind to me. David, I'm sure, would be taller, and I wondered whether Quentin would be staying there, still getting drunk on brandy and pursuing the ladies. The deep affection I had felt for the entire family warmed my heart, and I felt certain the reunion would be a joyful one. It was then I caught sight of a girl in a white dress running around the side of the house where the ballroom windows were reflecting the setting sun. Because she seemed young, I thought it must be Carolyn, and I cried out her name several times, but she must not have heard me, for she failed to turn around and slowly dissolved in the fingers of fog that reached up from the sea. The mist brought a chill to the air that a moment earlier had been a warm summer afternoon, and I realized dusk was coming on. Growing impatient, I tried the door. To my surprise, I found it unlocked. I called out, "Mrs. Johnson? Hello?" I was met by a deep silence. I walked into the entrance hall. The air seemed even colder, and called again. "Mrs. Stoddard? David?" My voice echoed into the drawing room and up the stair. The only sound I heard was the faint and faraway cawing of the ravens. Where was everyone? I remembered that the housekeeper, Mrs. Johnson, was always about, hovering, having arrived several months after I did. And Elizabeth, the matriarch of the Collins family, was a known recluse. I had been told that she had not left the premises for 17 years. Feeling even more than I might be trespassing, I was reluctant to venture further.
but I still held on with the thought that the family would be delighted to see me. I eased the door closed and leaned against it, breathing in Collinwood's peculiar odor of antique velvets, furniture polish, and wood fires, and remembering all that was familiar from the stairway to the landing, with its stained glass window, the table in the foyer, the clock with its carved mermaids, the heavy double doors leading down into the drawing room. I felt a gentle tug, something reaching for me, as if invisible arms embraced me. There was an unmistakable chill in the air, and waves of cold and warmth, like those layers you sometimes find in a river, flowed around my body. My first thought was ghosts, but I shrugged it off. What silliness. No flickering shadows descended the stairs or wafted into the drawing room. But some force was burning into my brain. Turning slowly, I was startled to see the face of the man I remembered well, that of Barnes Collins. His portrait had always hung beside the door, and so many times I had stopped to gaze into those hypnotic eyes when I had been the governess at Collinwood. His was a face that fascinated me, the majestic visage, the secretive smile, as if his many difficult years had bestowed both wisdom and melancholy. I backed away from the painting, sensing it held some power over me, and I clumsily bumped into the hall table, knocking over the bronze statue of a man leading a horse. It crashed to the floor, and the sound so startled me that I cried out. My voice echoed in the empty room. When, with a shaking hand, I returned the statue to its place, I saw that, except for the round spot where the horse had been standing, the table was thick with dust. My fingerprints streaked the shiny mahogany, and now as I looked around, I could see there was dust everywhere, on the sideboard, the banister, even the floor. I called again, "Mrs. Johnson? David, it's Victoria." But my voice bounced off the walls, as if I had wandered into an empty auditorium. Again, I felt a tug, as though a current flowed beneath my feet, and I tiptoed through the double doors into the drawing room, vaguely afraid of rousing some member of the family who might be resting or sleeping. At the same time, an odd feeling came over me I did not expect. It was as though I had come home. So familiar. The rose-colored carpet, the stone fireplace, the velvet settee, the side table with its crystal decanter. But the entire room was shadowed with a gray patina, and now I could see the weaving of cobwebs between the various pieces of furniture, filmy threads that swayed lightly as if to a faint breeze. To my surprise, I found a telephone on the sideboard and lifted the handle, also covered with dust. But the line was dead. I flicked the switch to the chandelier, but it failed to light. The house seemed to be abandoned. It was deathly quiet and desolate. Before I opened the kitchen door, I heard a noise, a sign of life. Scratchings, and then a clicking. I looked in and blinked my eyes against the gloom. Something was scurrying around on the kitchen table, which was heaped with bags of food. And in the dim candlelight, I caught a glimpse of a large, rounded body and a long, hairless tail. I thought it was a rat, but a rat of such enormous size, I shrieked when I saw it. At the sound of my voice, the creature hissed at me, and the two green pinpoints of light shone in my direction. Then I saw another of the same breed, loose-limbed and heavy, crawling over a black shape on the tabletop. clenched my teeth to keep from screaming. I thought it must be a rat, but so huge, it could only be an apparition. Both creatures slunk off the table and clung with their flesh-colored claws to the wooden legs, then wobbled over to the corner of the kitchen before one turned his bright eyes toward me again, watching me and chewing slowly. The candelabra was shaking in my hand, and lifting the light, I could just make out the pointed face and tiny sharp teeth, so rat-like in shape that I trembled as I tried to convince myself that the creature was harmless. Of all the things, it was only a possum, a woodland animal. How did it get in? Why were they there? Then I inhaled the odor of rotting food and slowly the realization that the house was not only deserted, but perhaps abandoned in haste, bloomed in my mind as goosebumps crawled across my shoulders and into my head. Skip a little bit here. Let's do one more little section. I read that part. Overcome by a deep weariness, I decided to leave the possums for the morning, and after lighting the entire candelabra, I climbed the stairs once again and passed Elizabeth's room and Carolyn's before arriving at my own. The door was closed but not locked, and I walked into a veil of memories. The room was stuffy from a lack of use, but my bed and dressing table, they were still there, my closet, many of my clothes, my chair by the window, and all my books. And as unbelievable as it seemed, they had kept them for me. Tears sprang to my eyes at the thought of so much trust and generosity that I didn't deserve. There was even a folded nightgown in my dresser drawer. After undressing, I went to the window, drew back the curtain, and opened the sash to the cold night air. The moon had risen, but was shrouded by a thick fog that rolled in from the sea. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the girl in the white dress, running through the tall grass. But she rounded the house and disappeared. I decided it must have been a trick of the moonlight. Feeling some trepidation, I locked my door and slid a chair under the knob. I crawled under the sheets, smelling the odor of attics and linens wrapped in trunks, and my mind flooded with thoughts of my time as a governess, parent for David. I smiled, remembering his tricks, the time he dressed up in a sheet pretending to be a ghost. In fact, he had hidden many times in that very closet at the foot of my bed, only to come leaping out with a great boom, hoping with his child's spitefulness to give me a heart attack. Once he had feigned his own hanging from the closet fold, and I opened the door looking for a jacket, only to discover his body dangling and swaying, his tongue thrust out from his mouth, and his eyes bulging in imitation of death. With this image in my mind, I fell into a fitful sleep and woke to see the window's white curtains rising and falling in the moonlight. I had the sense someone was in the room. I heard a sound, a sigh, and a moan. And standing at the foot of my bed was the girl in the white dress. Her hair was long and dark, and her bare arms reached out to me in a beseeching manner. Her eyes shone like slivers of silver. I held my breath and didn't move, certain that she was a ghost. But I did not recognize her. I whispered, Who are you? And she answered in an anguished voice, Save us. Please save us. I lay trembling, afraid to stir or speak until she disappeared, and after a time, I fell asleep again. I woke much later to the sound of maniacal laughter. It seemed to come from below, and yet it echoed down the hallway outside my door as well. It was a diabolical laugh, taunting, vindictive, lacking in mirth, a laugh that claimed ownership of the house and the night. Someone was in the drawing room, I was certain. Someone intoxicated and insane. I lit the candelabra, removed the chair from against the door, and crept out into the hall, feeling as much asleep as awake, wondering why my feet made no sound even on the tiled floor. I had a strange sensation that I had left my body lying in the bed, and I was floating, a floating spirit, moving slowly down the stair. The laughter died as I approached. But there was a glow emanating from the other side of the door, light flickering flames. My heart lurched. Had I left a candle burning and set the house on fire? But there was no blaze, only the glow from the painting that hung above the mantel. The portrait I had failed to notice earlier, but I recognized it for my time as a governess. It was Angelique, in her jewels and scarlet gown, her gaze imperious and amused. I stared at her, wondering whether she had been the source of the laughter, and her eyes burned into my soul. For some reason, I thought of the Browning poem. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. So now just one more thing. I woke again to a raucous, noisy chatter. The ravens were scratching at the glass, and I could see a fluttering of large black wings silhouetted against the moon. Fear rose up in me as if they were fighting to come into the room, trying to hook their yellow claws on the sash. They jabbed with their curved beaks, and their beady eyes glowed with a sullen anger. A murder of crows, I thought, and wondered if that was what they had in mind. Then, unable to bear the sound any longer, I rose and pulled the curtain closed against the furious battering and lay down again, waiting until their thumping merged with the beating of my own heart. The closed curtains had blotted out the moonlight, but now the room was filled with wind, its shapes moving about as if a breeze had entered, very cold. It jostled the shadows around me, dark and light. I heard whispers, cold, lisping sounds, and then I felt a jolt. My bed began to wobble, gently at first as though a small earthquake had shaken the house. I lay paralyzed, holding my breath. A poltergeist, I thought. I've chased away the good ghost, and now the mischievous ones are here. Then my feet began to rise. Something lifted the end of my bed, gripped it there, and let it go. It crashed to the floor, the springs ringing beneath me, and I reached for the edge of the mattress and held on. The bed rose again, and I screamed when it came thumping down, and my body bounced off the sheets. There was a shudder and a blessed silence, and I thought it had gone. But then again, something took hold, and I felt myself rise up slowly, sway slightly, hover several feet above the floor, as though the frame was tethered to the ceiling. I had heard that a poltergeist can tip a bed over, and I strained to keep it balanced and waited, suspended, floating, until it whisks itself away, and I came crashing down. I braced for another jolt, but with a moan, the wind drifted through the walls, out the door, under the window, or it was sucked into the keyhole. I don't know where, and then the room was eerily quiet again, and more silent than a cave. So anyhow, that's the house. Back to a completely deserted house, and everyone is gone, and that's the great mystery of the book. So I hope those of you who read will enjoy it. And I also should mention one other thing is that my books are on Audible. So if you don't read, you can listen to them. The first three, I recorded them all, and I had a great time doing it, going back and revisiting
all those many, many, many months of writing, and I had a great time. So I thank you for your patience and for being such a lovely, quiet audience. And now we're going to have a big costume ball, right?
Lara Parker, ladies and gentlemen. And now we're going to bring to the stage Nancy Kersey and Don Friend. Come along, big your hand, come on, big.